I want to talk about a hard subject today. I grew up in an alcoholic family. My father was severely alcoholic until I was probably 14 years old. My son Trey tomorrow will be 14. And I can only imagine what it would have been like for him to have to grow up in the life that I grew up in, knowing the struggles that our family endured because of someone's addiction, because that's exactly what it is. It's not a lifestyle choice. It's not a preference people make. It's something that gets into your life and it controls you. My wife, Amy, and I, who Amy's not here with us today because she's under the weather sick as well. But we made a conscious decision when we first married, because she grew up in that environment as well as I did, that we were not going to have our household go through that. And so we have been diligent about protecting ourselves as individuals and our family, our children, as young lives that need to have a positive influence in our life, not to have to be succumbed to those kind of events. And so as I mentioned earlier about how the church along the way in various forms, all congregations helped us, often it was because of a conscious choice that my dad had made to live a certain life and to give himself over to a power in his life that he had no control over. And he chose to allow it to do that. And so if it wasn't for God's church coming alongside of us, and many of those people in those little small 20, 30, 40 member congregations in eastern North Carolina making an impact in that way, as I have grown to mature in my relationship with Christ, I have seen how God works, and I have looked at how Jimmy mentioned about the influences that are taking place and how God is working behind the scenes to move you. And so I want to tell you today, if you're struggling, there's always hope and there's a way out. I'm going to use a passage of Scripture today that you're going to be saying, wait a minute, does that really deal with addiction? But I want you to understand the things that get in our life that can control us and we have reign in our life can really make some nasty influences and impacts on our life. I want you to be reading with me today in chapter 8. Now here's what the Scripture says, picking up in verse 26. If you're following along in the Pew Bible, it should be page 726 if you want to use that Bible. But here's what the Scripture would say. They sailed to the region of the Gerasenes, which is across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped ashore, he was met by a demon-possessed man from the town. And for a long time, this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but he had lived in the tombs. And when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had commanded the evil spirit to come out of the man. Many times it had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and had kept under guard, he had broken his chains and had been driven by the demon into solitary places. Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, because many demons had gone into him. And they begged him repeatedly not to order them to go into the abyss. A large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them go into them, and he gave them permission. When the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs. The herd rushed down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When those tending the pigs saw what had happened, they ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside. And the people went out to see what had happened. When they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone out, sitting at Jesus' feet, dressed in his right mind, and they were afraid. Those who had seen it told the people how the demon-possessed man had been cured. Then all the people of the region of the Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them because they were overcome with fear. So he got in the boat and left. The man from whom the demons had gone out begged to go with him, but Jesus sent him away, saying, "Return home and tell how much God has done for you." And so the man went away and told all over town how much Jesus had done for him. Now, I think there are many things that come to mind when we read a passage of Scripture like this. We certainly, first of all, see the power of Jesus. We see the destructive power of those demons that the man is wrestling with and had influence in his life. But do we ever really think about the man who was demon-possessed? This was a man, he was a human being. He was most likely someone's father. He could have been someone's husband. He could have been a successful businessman in his community. He may have held a respected position in the community. As long as we're speculating, just maybe we think about maybe he was a priest or a member of the Sanhedrin, or he was famous for one reason or another. But all of that has changed in his life. At some point, some evil influence has crept into his life, and it completely overtakes him. Now, maybe it was a slow, gradual progression, almost unperceivable in the man as he considered what was taking place. Maybe it was a whim he had experimented with, and something that in his life began to grow into a state where demons were allowed to enter into his life. Maybe it was something he just jumped head first into. He jumped right into it, and he found himself in this state before he realized what happened. Sometimes things like that happen. But regardless of the manner, the evil has completely overcome this man. It's taken his life. It's robbed him of everything. It's robbed him of his freedom, his family, his friends, his sanity, his everything. Now, I doubt anyone here has been demon-possessed. But as with any doubts, there's always an air of speculation as to, is there 100% foolproof? You talk to any missionary that works in some of the countries who are dealing with the influences of the occult there, and you find out what demon possession really could be. There are a lot of people who have lost control of their lives due to one reason or another because of the evil that has encroached upon them. They've lost their freedoms, their family, their jobs. They've lost their livelihoods because of the desire of some destructive behavior that they've allowed to become a part of their life. Now, Gary Collins, a Christian psychologist and counselor, he would write this: an addiction is anything or behavior that is habitual, repetitious, and difficult or impossible to control. And maybe today you're thinking, well, that's not me. I don't have those kind of problems. There's nothing in my life that has that kind of control over me, Daniel. So maybe you just preaching a sermon today that really has no bearing whatsoever for the folks that I know sitting around me. And yet, in 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter would write this in verse 19, for a man is a slave to whatever has mastered him. So maybe we need to ask ourselves then, if we're not addicted to anything, what is it that we're allowing to master our lives? Anything other than God that has control over our lives is that thing that is controlling us, and that is the thing that has become our master. And those things that will weigh us down, they hinder us in our lives, they hinder us in our relationships with the Lord and everyone else. Those are the things we need to be considering today. I want to give you 3 simple little things to follow today. If you follow along in your little handout or whatever from the bulletin, as you fill in the blanks, I want you to understand, first of all, as we look at this message as the baggage of addiction, that addiction can take many forms. We think about the most severe forms, don't we? Maybe we think about, first thing that comes to mind is alcohol and drugs. After all, it seems to be so prevalent in our society. It's in our families. It is in our churches, my dear friends, whether you want to admit it or not. There are few things probably as destructive in people's lives as drugs and alcohol. We've seen it. I've even mentioned a short, brief story and testimony of my own this morning, growing up in a family that way. I mentioned Amy's family. She had an uncle who was an alcoholic for years and did a great job of masking it. I mean, he was a master of deception when it came to being able to cover over his alcohol problem. From all outward appearances, he had it all going for him. He had a great business. He and his brother had taken over his father's plumbing business who they worked for before he passed. They had grown it successfully to probably each of them it was probably $1 million a year business turning over in revenue. And it got to the point where he and his brother could no longer do business together because of various issues that each of them were having. Much of it contributing to that of drugs and alcohol, they separated their business. Eventually, Amy's uncle, the one I'm speaking about, ends up losing his family because of his alcohol. Regardless if you think alcohol causes you to relax, let me tell you it does not. Scientifically proven it agitates, it does not cause you to relax. He began to beat his wife. He was aggressive toward his 2 young daughters. As a result, he lost his family and divorce. He ended up losing his home. He lost his vehicles. He lost his house, his everything. His business was soon gone. He found himself taking up little small odd jobs, and often you would find him riding the streets of Jacksonville on an old borrowed 10-speed bicycle, going over to the ABC store to buy his vodka or whatever it was that he was drinking on a daily basis. His mother and my wife's mother, often, which was his sister, gave him places to stay. They tried to help him as much as they possibly could, to no avail. He would come home drinking, and as a result, I can't tell you the number of times they had conversations with me about, what do we do? I said, put him out. But he has nowhere to go. Put him out. But what happens if put him out? Because until people realize that they are at the bottom, they will continue to use you as a springboard to bounce back to the place that they were. And unfortunately, sometimes when we're trying to help someone, we're actually enabling the very activity in their life that is causing so much damage in their life. You see, those are hard things to have to think about when we think about the addiction people deal with in their life. And I'm sure there's someone in your life that may be like that, a relative or a friend or a close person to you who was, for all lack of a better way of putting it, they were simply a drunk. And alcohol has cost them everything. You know, to be honest, there's no passage in Scripture that tells you don't drink. I mean, it doesn't come right out and tell you not to drink. But there are passages that tell us not to be drunk. Consider Proverbs chapter 23, verses 29 through 35 say, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaints? Who has needless bruises? Who has bloodshot eyes? Those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine. Do not gaze at wine when it is red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and a poison like a viper. Your eyes will see strange sights, and your mind imagine confusing things. You will be like one sleeping on the high seas, lying on top of the rigging. They hit me, you say, but I am not hurt. They beat me, but I don't feel it. When will I wake up so I can find another drink? There are a lot of people who think that they can handle alcohol. As a matter of fact, if you were to speak to someone about whether they think that they're addicted or they are an alcoholic or not, they would probably tell you no. The problem is, as we understand, one drink can impair the way you think and the way you act. Drugs are no better. In fact, they often enslave people even faster than the drink would. Sometimes just a pill or two or a puff or two is all that's needed to get someone hooked, and from there on, life becomes just a constant spiral. There are issues that people deal with drugs that many people on alcohol don't deal with, and then at the same time, there are many things that are very similar. Well, you say, well, he's talking about drugs and alcohol. There are people who are addicted to food or gluttony. Now, that's something we don't like to talk about, especially they were picking on me about how much I ate last night at the little banquet. But I know a man who was admitted that he was addicted to food. He compared himself to a drug addict. He lives in Nashville, North Carolina. He struggled with it for many years. But how many of us really do struggle in those areas? The Bible compares drunkenness. In Proverbs 23, verses 20 and 21, it says, do not join those who drink too much Do not join those who drink too much wine or gorge themselves on meat. For drunkards and gluttons become poor, and drowsiness clothes them in rags. Sure it does. You eat so much, tired, lazy, and you hear the sayings about people. They make statements about people who are overweight, about being lazy. They can't get anything accomplished. They have no energy, whatever the case is. I'm not casting judgment. Proverbs 23, verse 2 was a harsh saying. It says, and put a knife to your throat if you're given to gluttony. Boy, now isn't that hard? Scripture speaks very harshly of certain things. Wayne Smith, he's retired now. He just lost his wife. He was the preacher at Southland Christian Church in Lexington, Kentucky. He's best well known in that area for being the minister in his early years of ministry as he built his church, from traveling around and visiting with people. And he would often show up because it was in the area where the Kentucky Fried Chicken was just getting started. And he would go by and get leftover chicken. That's back in the day where they would give you the leftover chicken. And he would take a bucket or a bag of chicken, and he would stop by and say, he would see Toby and sitting on the porch, and he'd stop by and he'd walk up and have a bucket of chicken with him. They'd sit there and have a piece of chicken. And he knew another place that made pies, and he would go and get the pies at the end of the day, and he would bring those. And maybe you sit down and have a piece of lemon pie or chocolate pie, and everybody said, well, here comes the preacher. They were excited to see him. Now when I show up, they go, here comes the preacher. But Wayne would tell you he's battled his weight all his life. As a matter of fact, his own words are this. Other people get up from the table and say, excuse me. I get up and say, forgive me. Now, it may not be overeating. It could be anorexia or bulimia that you're dealing with, any compulsive behavior toward food. That is an issue that is just as destructive in people's lives as drugs and alcohol. But let's just don't stop there as we consider addictions people deal with. Let's think about people who struggle with sexual addiction. A recent Focus on the Family survey was startling. It said 1/5 of adults visit sexual websites. 80% of the teens that you come in contact with have been to such sites. Another study showed that 7% of internet porn traffic occurs between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Those are working hours. So people, when they're supposed to be working, are doing something else other than working. Now, it's not just the internet that is the problem. You know, there's books and magazines. They've been around for hundreds of years. You consider things now that they try to make into movies. You probably already bought your ticket in advance for the 50 Shades of Grey. Those are the kind of things that are influences, regardless if you want to call them, oh, that's just a movie, or this is not this, or that's not as graphic. But anything that falls into this area of temptation and sensuality could very well fall into the category of pornography. What about gambling? I mean, it's a growing area of addiction in our country. As a matter of fact, there was a tremendous debate just a few years ago when the state of North Carolina was deciding whether we wanted to have a lottery or not. And we talked about the benefits for education. So let's just call it the North Carolina Education Lottery. That'll help people let it pass when we decide to vote, and it won't be so hard for us to swallow. We'll take the money, the revenue we're making from that, and we will improve our school systems. Well, guess what? This past year, they voted to drop the name education from the lottery. You see, there's always back doors to issues. And it's not really solved, but so many of the funding problems for the school, if you go and do your research. As a matter of fact, the state now has a problem gambling program for people who are facing this addiction. And I think it's ironic that the state needs to begin a program that has to be started as a result of another program that the state started to handle the problem with the first program. These are issues that people deal with. They are naturally driven by certain things that take place in the progress of our life and the possession of it. And so let me ask you this question. Is there a behavior or substance in your life that is dominating things about you? If it is an addiction. The second thing I want you to understand, not only does addiction take many forms, but it can cost you everything. You remember I told you about my wife's uncle. But look at the man we've talked about in this text to begin with. If we just look at someone, we all say we wrestle with our own demons. Have you ever made that statement? We've got our own demons. I've got my own demons I'm dealing with. Be careful in the way you say that, because you may very well speak into the existence the opportunity for that very thing to take over your life. This man suffered from deprivation. Verse 29 says, for a long time this man had not worn clothes or lived in a house, but he lived in the tombs. He was deprived of his basic needs of life. He suffered alienation. As a matter of fact, verse 29 would say this, many times it had seized him, and though he was chained hand and foot and kept under guard, he broke his chains. Now, I think people are trying to look out for themselves. They really do try to cover their bases. They want to make sure we're protecting those around us as well, but maybe they chained him to help protect himself. As a matter of fact, the Bible would say that he suffered isolation in verse 29 because he says, and he had been driven by the demon into solitary places. He goes on to tell us that he even suffered mutilation. In Mark chapter 5, as Mark recounts it in verse 5, he says, night and day among the tombs and in the hills, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. These demons led him to physically hurt himself. You know people who are dealing with some type of addiction, they'll say, I don't know why you're getting on my case. I ain't hurting nobody. I'm not bothering you. I'm not doing anything. But sometimes we need to protect the person who is dealing with the addiction. And finally, I want you to understand, if you're really wrestling with anything, or you know people in your family are, or those close to you, or whatever the case may be, that freedom from addiction starts with Jesus. Now, that seems simple. After all, you're a preacher. You're supposed to say that. I was wondering when you were going to throw Jesus into this message. You spent all this time beating me up about things that possibly I've been dealing with, or I have dealt with, or am dealing with. I knew sooner or later you would have to mention Jesus. You see, I know that there are things that people are following in the world that they think is acceptable in the culture in which we live in. And so it should be all right. It's not frowned upon, and yet it's destroying their very life. Some of this is where we let things that other people do in life determine some of our own behaviors. I mean, you think about this week, read about people like Johnny Manziel. He's been nothing but a problem child since he was even in college. And then he goes to professional football, and what happens? He's known for his partying ways and having a good time and disobeying authority and everything else. And now he has to place himself in a treatment. You know why he's going into treatment just as well as I do. Just like so many other people. And they make it look like they're trying to help themselves, but it's pretty much been told, if you don't get your act cleaned up, you won't be here next year. I know some people are hard-headed and even stubborn. I know some folks will work to prove you wrong just because. I don't have a problem. My dad, for years, when people would mention to him about his drinking, I'm fine. I don't have a problem with drinking. You're the only ones you got a problem with my drinking. You know people like that. But I also know that there are some things you simply can't do alone. And that's the good news. That's the good news we need to get at. You don't have to, but you have to open up your life to letting something good come in to take away and take the place of the bad things that are happening. You see, Jesus is there to help us when other people can't. Luke tells us this man had been this way for a long time. As a matter of fact, I'm certain that he had probably tried to change. I'm certain other people had tried to change him as you read his story. And every attempt failed until Jesus appears on the scene. I want you to listen to how Bob Russell would describe this scene. When this demon-possessed man came running at Jesus, Jesus didn't rebuke him. He didn't banish him. He didn't chastise him. He demonstrated that he could calm a tormented soul just as easily as he could calm a tempestuous sea. He'd been possessed by a myriad of demons, and now he's controlled by Jesus. He was irrational, now he's in his right mind. He was naked, now he's clothed. He was alienated from people, living alone in tombs, and surrounded by people, sitting calmly at the feet of Jesus. He was tormented in his heart, and now he's peaceful. Whatever you're facing this morning, whatever those people around you are facing and struggling with, you need to understand that you need to come to Christ. And why not invite others to know Him if they really want to come out from underneath the things that are controlling them? Because there's only two ways. There is turning our life over to Christ and letting Him begin to work in us, or there is choosing to go the way we've been going, which ultimately leads us to the path of destruction. But by all means, we need to get the help we need. And in doing so, do not neglect Jesus. Luke would put it this way in Luke chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. He records a parable of Jesus about a man who had an evil spirit come out of him. Now, the evil spirit leaves, but the problem is the man, once he begins to get his act cleaned up, we could put it that way, he doesn't do anything good to make sure that he's replacing the bad behavior. My wife's uncle, who I spoke of earlier, tried to get his act together. He thought it would save his family. So he goes to Hebron Colony in the western part of the state. Now, while there, he's getting all off alcohol, so you know what he gets on? Cigarettes. They're replacing one addictive behavior with another one. But in a way, that's almost the way it happens. Look what Luke would say here about this evil spirit. He says, then it goes and it takes 7 other spirits more wicked than itself, and they go in and live there. And finally, the condition of the man is worse than the first. When my wife's uncle, though he got off alcohol, it started with cigarettes. Then when he comes back, he's back on alcohol, but that's not enough. And so he's adding another substance. And why? Because he failed to recognize that the place that put him, they spent all this time going to chapel and everything, but he did not let that take root in his life. He didn't let Jesus have control. And many people who are struggling with addiction today, or they're on the borderline with whatever they're suffering with, they're not coming through because maybe they're not allowing themselves to come out from underneath the bondage of whatever this demon that they're dealing with is, and letting Jesus and His Spirit have full reign in their life. You see, just stopping the bad is not enough. It needs to be replaced with the good. So let me ask you this question. Simple. What is it that's your master? I mean, if it's anything other than Jesus, if it's anything than a personal walk with Christ on a daily basis, and look, let me go and tell you, I know people who are Christians, who've known Jesus, who are suffering from an addiction. Read just this week where a lady up north in Boston area who is a bishop in the Episcopal Church who has had a problem for years with alcohol. And now she's facing about 13 charges because of a fatal car accident where she hit someone on a bicycle. You know, it's not just everybody out there. And one of the things I love about the church is I'm glad that we can be known as hypocrites sometimes. The great thing about when we come together as a church and we come in and we act like we can get our act together and everything's okay, you know what that shows me? There's hope for us because we can control it for a period of time. So that tells me if I can do it now, I can do it this afternoon. And if I can do it this afternoon, I can do it tomorrow. But what it does tell me is that there's always hope. So what are you dealing with? What is it that masters you? What is this baggage that you're dealing with that you just say, I've carried it around so long, I own it, and it's mine, and this is just what it is, and I've learned to live with it. And yet God says, let's just put it down. Let me have it. Let me take you to the place you really want to go. What I love about the story we read to begin with was, though we find this man in this depraved state, when it's at the end of the story, what do we find? Him sitting at the feet of Jesus and enjoying life. And when Jesus decides he wants to leave, though everyone else is afraid of what Christ is doing in this man, you notice what happened? They were used to the way things are. When something changes in your life for the good, when Christ is doing it, it's going to scare some people. And what took place in this man's life was so devastatingly awkward for these people. They said, Jesus, just leave. We don't know if we can handle that kind of life change. But you know what this guy said? Let me go with you. And maybe today, you just need to be saying, Christ, my Lord, let me go with you. Oh, it's going to scare some of the people that you've been living with daily. Your family are going to say, there is such a marked difference in you that I don't know what's going on. Maybe he or she's on something different now. It seems to be a good behavior, but at the same time, I'm afraid there's... Maybe you just say, look, now I'm addicted to Jesus. Would you do that today? I don't know what you're wrestling with. Many of you don't have a problem in the world, but there are some. You know, well, he's preaching to me today. I've got my own demons. And I've them long enough, and I've hurt myself long enough with them that I have to put them down. And as we get ready in just a moment to have our closing song, would you just come and lay it at the foot of the cross? That's what God asks you to do. But you have to be willing to take that first step. You know, AA has a 12-step program. They don't put you on number 12 till you start with number 1. And our program starts with the first step to Jesus. But you need to be willing to go to Him.